So, hello, dear ones, and greetings from the Center for Contemporary Mysticism in Philadelphia. My name is Joe Irwin, and it's a joy to gather with you again to explore this amazing journey that we share. Today's guest is Dr. Jeffrey Kripal. He's professor of philosophy and religious thought at Rice University, and for decades at the forefront of research in mystical experiences, psychic phenomena, paranormal, and more. He's author of, I think, 9 books, and he's chairman of the board of the world-famous Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. So today, Jeff is going to be discussing his newest book, which is right down our alley, How to Think Impossibly about souls, UFOs, time, belief, and everything else, and explore how these so-called impossible phenomena are not supposed to happen, but they do all the time. So it's kind of like, what's going on? So, Jeff, it's a pleasure to have you with us. We've been looking forward to this. So, welcome aboard. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Joe.
Also, we'll introduce, as most of you know, our interviewer, Patricia Pierce, who's an author, a former pastor, and spiritual teacher and host of the We Awakening podcast. And speaking of Patricia, in 3 weeks, actually 3 weeks from yesterday, on Saturday, November 9th, this is just a few days after the U.S. election, Patricia will lead our next event, which is an all-day contemplative retreat. And it's both in person as well as online. If you're in the Philadelphia area, you can come in person or join online. But after the polarization we've experienced over the many months and years in recent times, I think we will all be ready for a time to go within, to a place of union where all is held in love and only from which I believe a healed world can arise. So mark your calendar. Saturday, November 9th, either in person if you're in the Philadelphia area or around the world, as many of you who are logging in today, you can log in and participate in this wonderful fall retreat, contemplative retreat. So lastly, we'll take a moment to welcome each of you who are logging in today while we're live, or those who are watching later on our YouTube channel. If you're new to the center, be sure to visit our website. As I mentioned before, it's simply contemporarymysticism.org, and you'll find hundreds of resources, videos of past speakers and groups, sharing, study, meditation, and more. And remember, our goal is to be a partner with you. So if you feel that what we're doing is important, we invite you to get involved, volunteer, join, support, do whatever you feel called to do. Help us continue this work. And lastly, remember, we will have a Q&A session that follows our interview. So as we're going through our time together, if you have a question that comes to mind or something you'd like clarification on, you'll have a chance to dialogue one-on-one with Jeff and make a note of your question so that when we come to Q&A, you can click raise your hand. So now, without further ado, Patricia and Jeff, we'll turn it over to you, and I'll be back in a little bit for our Q&A.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Jeff.
Oh, thank you.
Looking forward to speaking with you about this book, How to Think Impossibly. And you work in the academic world and are really making the case that what we consider to be possible or impossible is largely culturally determined.
Mhm.
And you use the metaphor of the table. And I would love to just start off with that. Tell us about that metaphor of the table.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, thank you. Thanks for having me. By the table, I just mean, what I really mean to refer to is what we keep on the table academically or intellectually, or I suppose culturally, what we consider to be real and why we consider it to be real. And my sense is, just talking to lots and lots of people, a lot of professionals, is that they take a lot of things off the table. And it's so that they can explain the things that are on the table. And, you'll often hear this claim, well, my science or my worldview can explain everything. And my reply was, well, that's just because you've taken everything off the table you can't explain.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal of this book, really the goal of, I think, the comparative study of religion in general, is to keep everything on the table and to try to develop models and theories that that explain everything and not just some things. So that's really what I mean by the table.
Mhm. And what do you think are the consequences of, well, first of all, what sorts of things get taken off the table?
Well, that's pretty much us. We get taken off the table. I mean, we live in a scientific, secular worldview. At least I do. Maybe you all don't, but I do. And it's a very third person external view of things. And what gets taken off the table is anything involving subjectivity or consciousness or mind. Anything from the inside becomes illusory or hallucinatory, or people, whatever thing you want to pull out of the sky to take this off the table, people take off the table. And so, my joke is, well, science is really good at explaining everything except, of course, us. That's a huge hole. That's a huge hole. It's an abyss, actually, and it's in that abyss or that hole that the humanities said, or the area at least I inhabit, trying to understand the human, trying to figure out what a human being is and what a human being is capable of, and so that's the main thing I think we take off the table. I also think we operate with a kind of order of knowledge and order of reality. The more physical something is, the more literal it is, the more real it is, and the less physical something is, the less real it is. And so the things that deal with material reality are real, and so we're constantly asking for proof or empirical proof, which just kind of is circular in my opinion. It just reinforces this physical worldview. And those things that cannot be slotted into that physicality or that materiality are seen as not real, or as not true.
Mhm. And I'm guessing, I mean, I also grew up in the same worldview. I mean, I think probably most of the people watching this did. And many of us then had experiences in our lives that blew that worldview apart.
Right.
And experiences like you're talking about that don't fit into that paradigm. And, that it just like, and oh man, there's so many directions I could go right now. Um, one of the challenges I think of those of us who've had those experiences, and I'm sure you encounter this all the time, is the tendency to keep them to ourselves,
Right.
to stay closeted in these mystical experiences, because not only are they taken off the table, but they're diminished, they're dismissed, sometimes they're denigrated as hallucinatory, crazy. I mean, when you're having that kind of experience, it's like everything, and this, to use the title of your previous book, everything flips. And what you once thought was real is seen to be illusory, and what was illusory you see to be real. So what would you say? Because I'm guessing a lot of people watching this video, hold those experiences close to the vest. What would you say to us?
I would say a lot of things. First of all, secrecy or confidentiality, or not speaking about an impossible experience, I think is the normal human response to these things. And so what I try to do as a teacher, or certainly as a speaker, is create a space of security, a space of safety, so that people can speak about their experiences, however strange or out of the ordinary they are. Um, I would also say that sense of secrecy or confidentiality protects that secular or scientific worldview. I get asked all the time, how common are these experiences? And my response is always very common, but they're not talked about. They're very rare. It's very rare that someone talks about them, particularly a person in authority, particularly a person in a white coat. I don't have a white coat on, but particularly a scientist or a politician or a leader of some kind almost is never going to talk about them. And the reason they don't talk about them is because they challenge the worldview that is reigning or is or is in the order of the day. And so I think there are good reasons not to speak about these things, but it also leads to human suffering. It leads to psychological issues, spiritual issues. Um, People feel conflicted and rejected by the broader worldview because they can't talk about probably the most important thing that ever happened to them. These are not tangential experiences. It's not like I'm going to go get an ice cream cone or get a cup of coffee or something. I mean, this is, an out of body experience or a near death experience is probably the most important thing that ever happened to someone, and that is precisely what they can't talk about. So that leads to suffering. That leads to a kind of secrecy that I think is ultimately a bad idea, but it's probably a necessary idea in terms of the broader culture that keeps these things down.
Mhm. Yeah, and one of the things that the Center for Contemporary Mysticism has done is given people a safe space to talk about those things,
Yeah.
to share the things that they don't feel at liberty to share in other places. And I think it's really important because we need each other. We need companions on the way.
Yeah. I mean, Patricia, the other thing I would say, this kind of, so first of all, my first category that I loved was mysticism, by the way. I mean, I was trained by a man named Bernie McGinn, who's probably one of the world authorities on the Christian mystical tradition. And so mysticism is very dear to my heart. On the other hand, the contemplative traditions don't help here, frankly,
Mm.
um, because they dismiss these experiences too.
Yeah.
And so somebody gets hit pretty hard from both a religious side and from a scientific side, and both sides are telling them not to pay attention.
Mhm.
And what I'm trying to say is we need to pay attention.
Yeah.
These experiences are trying to tell us something. We need to listen, but we need to listen carefully because the phenomena themselves are not always what they seem to be. So there's a kind of internal deception or trickery going on that's part of the message too, I think. So it's complicated. It's complicated. It's a rabbit hole inside a rabbit hole inside a rabbit hole. So
Mhm. So what sorts of things have you encountered that people have shared with you or you've heard about that have challenged you to keep them on your table?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if anything challenges me anymore. I've sort of put my hands up and said,
Mm.
it's anything could happen and everything does. I think early on though, I mean, I was raised, was trained intellectually in a kind of psychoanalytic tradition, and I tended to see things in that light. But I was always open, I think, to a spiritual component or a transcendent component. Um, I was really converted or flipped into this interest in the 2000s by people who kept telling me stories that I knew couldn't have happened, but I knew that happened. And I knew that these people were not lying to me and they weren't making this up and they weren't exaggerating. And all the reasons you hear, in the public or the media, I knew none of those were true. And that certainly in the academy, we had no way of dealing with these things other than turn them into some kind of social representation or some kind of cultural form of power or knowledge or something. And I just found all of that really inadequate to
Mhm.
to to inadequate in the sense that it didn't deal with the reality that these individuals were sharing with me and how they had been traumatized really not just by their secular or scientific culture but also by their religious tradition.
Yes.
And I honestly,
Yeah.
I decided to side with the people over the religion or over the
Yeah.
science.
Yeah. Yeah. I get that. I was a pastor, and I didn't feel at liberty to share my yeah. So a lot in this book that you recently published, How to Think Impossibly, you go one section of it, quite a bit of it in the early part is about UFOs. and people's experiences with that. And that's outside my realm of familiarity. I haven't ever spoken with someone who's had that kind of an experience.
Mhm.
Can you say more about, is there anything unique about that kind of experience that, as you think about like altered states of consciousness and near-death experiences and some of those things, um,
Well,
what draws you? What pulls you to that?
what pulls me to that is people again.
Mhm.
And I think what most people, or not most people, what many people don't realize about the UFO topic is that saucers are very much related to souls, and souls are very much related to saucers. And so you have a lot of religious or spiritual experiences around UFO contacts. And generally, what's happened in the media, in the military, and even the halls of Congress is they've sliced off that soul part, that experiential part, and they focused on the object in the sky or the spaceship or whatever it might be. And they've seen that as what I call we call it a threat narrative. It's a kind of Cold War invasion narrative. And I just think that's wrong. I just
Yeah.
think that's a great way to not understand what's going on.
Mhm.
But it's a very human way. So it allows me as a historian of religions to kind of dig down into why we're doing this projection, this Cold War projection, but also what's wrong with it. And why, again, when we slice off that soul stuff, we're taking that off the table. So we're getting rid of all the experiencer accounts, which are very weird and absurd, by the way, on the surface, so that we can focus on science again and aviation safety or fighter craft or radar or something. And I just that's a slice of it. I'm fascinated by the physicality of the phenomenon or the material nature of the phenomenon, but that's clearly not the full phenomenon. And I'm interested in the whole thing. I'm interested in keeping everything on the table. And the UFO topic is just really interesting to me because it's a clear example of taking things off the table again so that you can explain the things that are on the table.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, the first chapter actually doesn't address UFOs at all. I mean, it's really about the world of the dead and the experience of the dead and the experience of the soul. And the second chapter gets in quite a bit to the topic of the UFO, and then the third chapter deals with it briefly, and then I move on to other things. But yeah, it's one example of an impossible phenomena happening all around us. I don't think they're rare either, Patricia. I
Mhm.
think I think they're extremely common. I think
Mhm.
UFO sightings are as common as water. We just,
Mhm.
again, we suppress them.
Yeah, and one of the things that you bring out in your book is and it's just an example of how we interpret things according to our paradigm, that this is seen as like a spatial thing, like some entities coming from a different part of space, when actually there may well be a temporal thing. And
Right.
there's a theory that, perhaps this is us in the future
Right.
coming back and like, yeah, so when we really open up our minds, it's just like, whoa, how do you then find your own bearings? I mean, I guess you just,
Well, I don't find my own bearings, by the
there
way.
are no bearings.
I mean, that thinking impossibly, the bottom line of thinking impossibly is not assuming one's worldview,
Yeah.
not thinking one's thoughts and not believing one's beliefs, but
Mhm.
reflexively stepping out of those thoughts and beliefs and considering other thoughts and beliefs, other worldviews. And so I'm very comfortable in that not knowing and that reflexivity, but it is lonely, Patricia. I'm not proposing that as an answer. Um, I think it's very comfortable and very human to want to have a set of beliefs or a worldview or a community or a set of rituals. But that has not worked for me. And but I don't see my answer or the Academy's answer as a solution or as an answer to everyone's needs or issues. I think it's complicated. Um, I'll give you an example. I mean, we're talking in the abstract here. So a few years ago, I heard a woman speak actually in a medical center, and she spoke about getting struck by lightning and her near-death experience in the parking lot of her synagogue. And I was like, wow, Elizabeth, that's a great story. And you should write a book about that. And to which Elizabeth responded, well, I never written a book. And I was like, well, I know how to write books, but I don't have a great story. And so we wrote this book together called Changed in a Flash. And the reason that story is so important here is, first of all, she didn't tell it for 25 years, 26 years. And I asked her why. I said, Elizabeth, why didn't you tell this story before? And she said, well, I was afraid for my children. I was afraid I would be made fun of, you know. I was afraid I was going to lose friends. And I said to Elizabeth, I said, well, you are going to lose friends when you tell this story, but you're also going to gain new friends. And she tells this story in a way, and it's very clear that her near-death experience sometimes fit into her Jewish tradition and sometimes did not. And it left her, as she says, much more spiritual, but a lot less religious. And I think that's a common conclusion of people. I mean, that's a modern language, being more spiritual but not religious, and it's sort of vague and abstract, but it does capture something about these moments where people recognize the existence of the soul or consciousness, you know, beyond the body, but they are much less committed to their religious tradition, whatever it is, or if they don't have one, whatever the secular tradition is, they're much less convicted by it or convinced of it.
Mhm. Yeah. And you use the term thinking with, and you hyphenate those two words, and that to think impossibly is to think with experiencers of all varieties. And I'm curious what it has been like for you to think with some of the experiencers that you've come to know. How has your worldview been altered?
So a lot. My world's been completely altered, to be frank about it. I hyphenate think with because first of all, I'm very serious about that. I don't mean, oh, you just take these experiences and you think about them. I mean, no, you sit down with these people, you know, these people become friends, they become colleagues. Their worldview impacts your worldview in a really practical kind of day-to-day way. For example, the whole third chapter I wrote with a self-described autistic man named Kevin. And Kevin tells his own story in his own words in that chapter. And I listened to Kevin, and I think Kevin's right about what he has to say. Well, I couldn't know that. I'm not autistic. I'm not neurodiverse, as they say.
Mhm.
But other people are. And so I think it takes all of us to sort of get a handle on this phenomenon, and that when we think with each other, we're much closer to the elephant in the room, as it were, than when we just think about it alone or from our own perspective. I don't valorize or idolize my perspective, Patricia. I have a perspective, but I think it's a good one to the extent it's from many perspectives, there's many people. I don't think it's that great when it's just Jeff. I think Jeff is pretty stupid and dull, but he's pretty smart when he thinks with other people.
Mm.
And I also, you know, that phrase too. So there's something else I want to say there. I'm an intellectual. I mean, thinking's my job. I happen to really like thinking and writing, and experiencers don't. You know, um, but there's a kind of worldview or philosophical position embedded in their experience that I can draw out. And I can say,
Mhm.
hey, look, this is what I think you're saying. And they're like, oh, yeah, maybe I am. And so they're appreciative of the intellectual tools I can bring to the project, but I'm extremely grateful for the experience that they bring and the kind of implicit thinking that they bring to the project, which I otherwise wouldn't have access to.
Mm.
I wouldn't know, you know.
Mm. And it seems that you are in this really unique role of thinking with and exposing yourself to these experiences and the implications of them, and then serving as a bridge, if you will, to the academic world. And I mean, you know, you're in some ways we're preaching to the choir in this particular gathering because, you know, people are on board. I think but surely, you know, we're all challenged in many ways, but it's really heartening to know that people such as yourself are really making an effort to bring these other dimensions of human experience into that realm. And I'm just wondering how that's going for you.
Well, what people usually say is, how do you deal with all the pushback?
Yeah.
To which I say, what pushback?
Uh-huh.
There isn't really much.
Uh-huh.
What I really think, okay, so there's a couple things I say here because I get asked this a lot. So a lot of us in the study of religion in the academy, I think most of us began in a religious community, and we had some question or some issue that we really wanted to see addressed, and it couldn't be addressed in that tradition, or it literally couldn't be spoken. It literally couldn't be. So we backed in to the academy as really the only institution that would have us, is my joke.
Mm.
Um, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think intellectuals are weird people to begin with, in the sense they don't fit in, but they backed into the academy as a kind of social form or practice in which their questions are not only welcome but rewarded. Um, the other thing I think a lot, I say a lot, is that I think most intellectuals are in the closet. I don't think they're actually resistant. They themselves have had out of body experiences or near death experiences, or seen a UFO or a ghost or something, or their brother has, or their spouse has, or their mother has, or they knew instantly when their grandmother died, or they have some experience, or they knew right away when so and so is going to call. They have some experience, whether it's minor or major, that they can relate to. And what they most don't want to do, though, they don't want to sound like the tabloids. They
Mm.
don't want to be embarrassed. And so what I do, Patricia, is I just go into their university and I start talking to them in the language of literary criticism or physics or history or whatever their language is. I say, here's, and then they're like, oh, so that's how you can do it. That's how you can talk about these things in a way that sounds like us. I mean,
Mhm.
you can do it actually. And um, so I'm very much of the conviction that we actually do have the tools to at least start talking about these things. We may not have the tools to figure them out or to explain them, but we certainly have the tools to talk about them. But that we need to do that. We need to do that publicly and in writing and in lectures or public talks, so that people can hear us and feel more at ease, come out of the closet, as it were.
Mhm. Well, it gives it has a way of legitimizing, I guess I would
Yeah.
say, legitimizing the experiences. If people in the academy are talking and writing about these things, then you know.
That's the strategy. That's
Mm.
exactly the strategy. Is I mean, I wrote a book called Authors of the Impossible, and the whole point is, how do we authorize this? How do we, and why are these impossible experiences, why do they so often express themselves in language? Well, they want to be languaged. They want to become part of our language, part of our storytelling, part of our culture. So I think there is an impulse in the phenomenon itself to be turned into public culture, or into art, or into religion or philosophy, or science, or whatever the expression might be.
Mhm. And I think about this, well, circling back to how culturally determined the possible is from the impossible. And the ramifications for us personally as well, not just culturally, but the, you know, how we ourselves perceive what's impossible or possible. So it's just all these layers of sort of censoring our human potential and our human experience.
Yeah, I think we're heavily buffered.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what a body and a brain does when it's relatively healthy is keep most of reality out.
Right.
And I
And
think
the yes.
yeah, and I think what happens in these experiences is that reality comes crashing in, not
Mm-hmm.
because it needs to crash in, because we're so buffered from it, we're so
Mm-hmm.
separate.
Yeah. Yeah. The mind or the brain is filter rather than generator of consciousness. And let's just sort of go there for a minute because you talk about how, well, the world is one, but the human is two.
Right,
And that, I mean, my take on what you're saying there is that reality is a unified whole, but we humans split it into material and mental.
right,
Right.
right.
So,
Because
yeah,
we do. That's
because what?
that's what we do.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, and you also talk about, and I want to read this towards, you say, I can see at this point in my life that my books and maybe my entire life work has been about one thing, teaching humans how to be God and God how to be humans.
Right.
I
Yeah,
was with you until that last phrase, and I thought, wow, teaching God how to be human. So, talk to us about that.
but first of all, that's a great line.
I thought so.
Uh, well, I think we suck at being God, and I think God pretty much sucks at being us. I mean, look what we've done to people who have realized their divinity. We've essentially killed them, or sacrificed them, or silenced them, or made fun of them. So I think it's obvious that we're no good at aligning ourselves with this sort of divine nature. But I also think, this divine nature, I mean, if you look at the history of religions, it's actually a history of fear and trauma and violence, and it's pretty bad. And particularly if you happen to be a woman, by the way, or someone who's not white, I mean, it's really nasty. And that's before you get to things like sexual orientation and all kinds of other things. So I think there's a lot of things about our religious and cultural traditions that are really awful to individuals. And that's what I mean about God, as in the scripture or the Bible or whatever scripture you want to name, is just not very good to individuals and to people who don't align themselves with that particular worldview or that particular notion of deity. Um, so that's what I mean. I think we desperately need the study of religion, the critical study of religion, to be healthy and whole. But I also think we need to affirm and understand that people do have these states of consciousness in which they align themselves with the cosmos or God or some larger life force, and we have to stop making fun of those and persecuting them, which is what we've done in the past.
Mhm. And there's no way of knowing what 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 arises, what emerges when we actually open ourselves up to that. Like what sort of potential could be unleashed?
No, I don't. My joke is, well, what is the limit of a human being? And I don't. I'm not sure there is one.
Mhm.
You know,
Mm.
um, and I mean that. I mean, people have the most remarkable experiences, and then they shut up about them, as you said earlier. Because
Mm.
the not only the potential but the reality is just too great.
Yeah. Yeah. So you talk also about the role of the imagination, and this really intrigued me because people will have these transcendent experiences that take the sort of lift them out of their sort of their rigid worldview. And then you talk about the role of the imagination in mediating those experiences.
Right.
Can you say more about that?
So yeah, I can. Again, let me give you a concrete example. So So I talk to a lot of people who have had near-death experiences.
Mhm.
And probably every one of those near-death experiencers wants me on some level to say that their particular vision of the afterlife is the true one.
Mm.
And I'm like, well, but it's not. Because if I sign my name to your vision of the afterlife, it means I can't sign my name to everyone else's. And so there's something about the near-death experience that is culturally mediated. It's mediated by the imagination. But there's also something behind that mediation that I think is very real too. And I'm trying to encourage us to think in those both and terms, and not in an either or way, not in a literal way or a debunking way.
Mhm.
In other words, I think if you fall into either or, either it's literally true or it's not, then you're going to fall into either religious belief or debunking.
Mhm.
That's what you're
Mhm.
going to do.
Yeah.
But if you see the experiences mediated by the imagination, then suddenly you can make sense of all these experiences in a way, and you can accept them and yet not interpret them literally or naively. And so
Mhm.
that's what I mean. But the book itself, it sort of pushes on that, because sometimes what happens is I really do think this. I think the human imagination has physical effects. And again, we are constructed to assume that there's an inner me, there's a mental dimension, and then there's an external physical dimension, and never the twain shall meet.
Mm.
But what happens when the physical dimension expresses the mental dimension? What's going on? How do we explain that one? Well, we don't. We just say that's crazy. Well, that doesn't mean anything. You just copped out right there.
Mm.
And so this is where, and I say the world is one, but the human is two. What I'm trying to get at is when the material dimension behaves in a way that corresponds perfectly to the mental dimension, the world is behaving as one.
Yes.
And then we split it in two, and we think, oh, there's a material world out there and there's a mental world out here. But that's us. That's what we do. That's what philosophers call an epistemological move.
Mm.
We do that. But ontologically, what's actually so is that those two dimensions are the same world. And so of course they're going to correspond, or
Yeah.
sometimes correspond.
Yeah. Yeah. As you speak of that, I mean, the just implausible, totally implausible synchronicities. And
Yeah,
just,
I mean, I'll just the thing
yeah.
the one I give you in the book with, and the example I always give is, well, what do you do when someone dreams the future?
Yes.
And I don't mean they guess, I don't mean they intuit. I mean they literally dream in exact detail, in exact banal detail, what is going to happen 10 years away or 20 years. What do you do with that?
Right.
Well, you don't do anything with it. Generally, you take it off the table and you say, well, I'm
Right.
not going to think about that. That didn't happen. Or, oh, that's intuition, or that's lucky guessing. Well, again, those are not explanations. Those are just things you pulled out of the sky to explain, to not explain a phenomenon that happens all the time, actually.
Yeah.
And so the book
Yes.
begins, if you recall, with Zora Neale Hurston as a little
Mhm.
girl.
Mhm.
She has all of these, she calls them stereopticons, a slideshow in her head of things that are going to happen in her future life, and they all play
Mhm.
out in
Mhm.
in the order she has them, and the exact detail she has them. Well, again, that makes no sense. Like that's impossible in this world we assume to be true, but it clearly is not impossible because it happened.
Right. It's not possible also, in a sense of linear time,
No,
believing that time is linear,
right.
so, um, and as you talked about the mental and the material being one, I immediately thought of this synchronicity I experienced many years ago. I was planning a trip to Scotland. No, I was planning a trip to England, and I was trying to decide if I ought to tack on a visit to Iona in Scotland. And I didn't know, should I go? Shouldn't I go? It's more money, and it was like I needed to get my airline ticket and time is running out to make this decision. So I leave work, I go to a food truck to get my dinner, and there in front of the food truck is a man in full kilt regalia, and he's playing the bagpipes. I mean, this on the streets of Philadelphia, and that has never happened since. So it's like that's those kinds of moments are when that whole idea of this separateness of consciousness and matter, it just collapses.
Right. Yeah. And the argument of the book is that that's really profound. That's really cool. If we thought that, then we would suddenly, well, not suddenly, but we would be in a new world pretty soon. And it's a really cool world.
Yes, and that the possibilities it could open up to us when we really truly begin to think with
Yeah.
one another.
Right.
Think with one another.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, this has been really wonderful, and I thank you for this conversation. I want to give time now for any questions from our attendees. And I'm going to turn off my video and poof, disappear, and Joe will be coming back on to lead
Okay.
us.
Well, thank
in
you.
that.
Thank you, Patricia. I appreciate the conversation. You made it easy. I didn't have to blab about anything. I could just answer questions.
So I'll invite Joe to come back on now, and as soon as he does that, there he is. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay. Okay, we'll be back with Patricia in a little bit. So thank you, Jeff and Patricia, for that thought-provoking and stimulating dialogue. We're going to open up now into Q&A and see if some people have some questions that they might like to share with you and continue our dialogue. And so as we do that, you have to click the button that says raise your hand. And we ask you when you come on to identify yourself, where you're from, and hold your questions or comments to about 2 minutes so we can get others on. And if you prefer not to show your smile on the live screen, you can enter a question in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to those as we have a chance. So it looks like we have a question from Jennifer. And Jennifer, you will see on your screen that you can join as a panelist and then start your video. So, yep, and start your video and unmute. Okay, come on, and that way you can ask a question. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Jeff and Patricia, for this wonderful conversation. My question has kind of got two parts. The first part is, do you think, is your experience that it's getting easier potentially to talk about these things? And whether or not it's getting easier, could there be, in your experience, in your view, I know you don't want to be too attached to your views, but could there be any kind of direction or plan to these experiences? You know, is the Earth potentially transitioning in a certain direction that we need to have more of these or need to talk about more of these? Or has this always been so? I know there have been times when phenomena like this were perhaps regarded as more naturally occurring, that sort of magical reality. But I'd love to get your sense, if I may, on that, whether there's any kind of direction to this, a direction of travel, I guess.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me try to answer both of those questions. First, from where I sit, so from my place in the American Academy, it is getting easier. I think there is more of an openness around these things, but it's also a generational openness. I think younger people have fewer hangups, frankly, around this than my generation did, or certainly ahead of me. But that's not to say that the younger generations are more aware of the implications. I'm not idolizing the younger generations. I just think there is more of an openness around them. Now, to the question, the follow-up question to whether there's an intentionality or an agency here, I would say yes, but so to go back to the UFO issue, there's two major anxieties around the UFO phenomena. One involves nuclear energy and the other involves nature or ecological collapse. That's been the case for 60 years. That is not that's not a recent anxiety. And a lot of the UFO encounters are actually over nuclear bases, or the abductees or contactees speak of ecological collapse or environmental challenge. So I think there is an ethical impulse embedded in those experiences. What I want to warn against is that there's some kind of natural or easy moral or political impulse in the phenomena. I think that's up to us. I think you can use these abilities to harm people, frankly, as easily as you can to redeem them or to develop a new kind of global worldview. I think you could do either. My own view is the latter. I talk about a sociology of the impossible, by which I mean that we're much more connected than we think we are. And one of the reasons, to go back to the UFO, one of the reasons I love UFOs is they don't care about national borders. They can care less. It just doesn't matter. And so I think there's something about impossible phenomena that our political and our national divisions are just irrelevant. And I think that this really does unite us in a way that is fundamentally positive and future oriented.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Sherry. I was going to bring her on. Sherry, if you'd click the button that says join as panelist and start your video, we'll bring you on. There you go. And click start your video and unmute, and we can have you on and ask a question.
Hi. Yes, I've enjoyed this so much. And for me, this past hour has been more real than the other world that doesn't always feel so real. So I just appreciate listening and learning. I'm curious if you've ever done any work with developing worlds or with indigenous people who tend to maybe be a little bit more connected to their self, where they envision, they're not two humans, the material isn't so separated from the mind. And do you find that or if you haven't done work with them, would you expect them to be a little bit more connected to the impossible?
Thank you, Sherry.
Yeah, well, thanks, Sherry. So my early work was all in South Asia. I mean, in that sense, I certainly am very prone and oriented towards non-Western worldviews. I think indigenous worldviews, I mean, yes, they tend to be much more unitary or much more along these lines that I'm talking about. I don't know. I haven't studied those cultures. I haven't lived with them. My guess is that indigenous peoples have probably inhabited and absorbed a lot of Western worldview as well as a lot of their indigenous worldview. I suspect it's complicated, but I just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a general desire on the part of some Western intellectuals to idealize particular cultures. I'm always wary of that, to be honest. I think human beings are messed up wherever you go, to put it mildly. So I don't want to idolize a particular culture or a particular worldview. I think they're all useful and helpful to challenge one another, to challenge each worldview, but I think none of them have what I would want to see in a future oriented worldview.
Thank you. Judith, Judith has a question. If you would click join as panelist and turn on your video and unmute. Yeah, unmute.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been great, so exciting, the potential of it. My question is, I have had some experiences of the impossible, but they seem random, and I certainly don't have control over them.
Right.
And I would like to know how to get back to the future, so to speak. And like, are there ways that we can, is it just that I'm just not mentally developed enough to do it, or in this human brain, or are there ways that we can break through that and experience um what experience intentionally, for example, temporal travel?
Right.
Thank you, Jude.
No, those are great questions. So, this gets back to the indigenous non-Western question too. I think one of the things that these phenomena really challenge is the notion of human agency. I think in the Western secular world, we imagine that we're individuals and that we have agency and we have rights and, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole worldview wrapped around those notions. And I think what a lot of these phenomena show is that we actually don't have agency. That these things happen to us fairly randomly and without our assent or our will. And sometimes that's experienced negatively, sometimes it's experienced positively. But I do think that we have to really rethink the notion of human agency. In terms of operationalizing or turning them into some kind of practice or some kind of technology, this, of course, is always the dream. This is what people want. There's appear to be a kind of built-in mechanisms to prevent that. The whole history of religions, particularly around future, divination is probably one of the most universal ritual systems there are. I mean, there's countless forms of divination. People have been trying to tell or control or manipulate the future for as far as we can see back. I'm not sure. I don't think we're there yet. I think the dream of technologizing this is, dangerous, to be honest. And I don't know. I don't know what I think of that, other than I don't study people who claim to be able to manipulate or do this on call. I study people who are often traumatized and to whom these things happen. And that gets around a lot of fraud and a lot of trickery, but it also gets around the question of how do we operationalize it or turn it into a technology. I just don't know. I really don't see a way to do that at the moment.
Great. We have a couple of Q&A questions that came in on our Q&A board, and a couple of them relate to wanting to hear a little bit more about UFOs and the soul connection.
Yeah.
The soul connection or relationship, and how often, it all gets dismissed as as a conspiracy and all of that. But there's been interest in hearing a little more about UFO and the soul connection.
Yeah. Well, again, the first two chapters of the book are pretty much all about souls and UFOs. And so I would encourage the questioner to really go to the book, because I spent weeks and months answering that question, not a few minutes. I mean, to answer it very briefly, if you listen to experiencers who have experienced abductions from UFO or entities on UFOs, the dead often appear. And sometimes they're dead people that the person doesn't even know are dead in waking life. So there definitely is a connection between the near-death experience and the abduction experience, for example. And that's what gets denied or sliced off in the common conversation around the UFO in the military and the media. And I think that's profoundly unfortunate. I also think UFOs are eschatological, by which I mean they're about the end things. They're about the end of life, or the end of a life. And so I think it's natural that a soul or the world of the dead, appear as well. I think that's That's simply the nature of the phenomenon. And souls, of course, often appear as round objects or as saucers. I mean, that's just that's in the history too.
I wanted to ask you something that relates to what you were talking about. For example, a case where somebody sees very specifically into the future, right down to the details.
Right.
Um, I don't know if you've ever thought of it, but a part of this has to do with the illusion of time. And it has often occurred to me in many ways that, all of this stuff is happening at the same time. And
Right.
I think of it as like an old phonograph record, where the needle is put is kind of what we're experiencing in our everyday reality, but you can pick up the needle and set it over somewhere else and have a different reality and experience, but it's all going around and happening at the same time. I don't know if that ever enters your
Well, sure. I mean,
work.
that exact image enters the literature, Joe. I
Yeah.
mean, the notion of a phonograph or an old vinyl record that we
Many
both
people
remember.
don't remember them.
I remember them well, actually. What's interesting about impossible phenomena is they tend to track technologically. The
Yeah,
metaphors tend to track
right.
technologically. And of course, now everything is computer oriented or AI, but it used to be, a phonograph, and then it was a radio, and then it was a telegraph, and then it was, a clock. And I mean, it keeps going back. And they're all, of course, wrong.
Uh-huh.
But they're technological metaphors that I think do work. I think the notion of having experience in banal detail 3 years or 10 years into the future does suggest that the future has already happened.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the takeaways. If you want to keep this stuff on the table,
Yeah.
if you want to keep precognition on the table, I think you have to consider that time is not what we think it is. We don't happen to sit on this wave of time, and this is in the past and this is in the future, and we just magically sit on this wave of all cosmic and universal time. I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so what always comes up here is the issue of free will. And again, free will is a Western democratic kind of value that is not shared by other cultures and other times. So I think that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, when we look to the past, it's all determined, but none of us says we didn't will it. We didn't have, for some reason, when we look to the future and it's all set up, we somehow say, well, we don't have free. Well, why? Why the distinction? And again, I think it's completely relative.
Right.
I don't think that it's a valid thing to look to the past and look to the future differently.
Yeah, another thing that came to mind in the beginning when you're talking about the risk of being open with some of these things and just bringing them out, it reminds me of one of our guests a year or two back, a Bishop Carlton Pearson. He was a well-known bishop and leader in the Pentecostal church. And he had an experience to where God came to him in a dream and said, "Why are you preaching all this hell and damnation? I don't send anybody to hell. I love everybody, as sinners and righteous included. And why are you preaching this?" And he had the courage to come out and say that in his church. It's one of these big, Pentecostal churches of several thousand people. And he started preaching this new understanding, and it eventually cost him, his job and his church and everything else. I mean, it completely ran him off, and he had to sort of start over with a different view of
Right.
of what it's about. And that's a fascinating story. And people interested could look on our YouTube channel and hear him talking about it. He's Bishop Carlton Pearson. But I wanted to bring that up because you've mentioned, sometimes why this stays silent.
Well, I don't think our religious traditions are up to this.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
like, take the near-death experience, coined in 1975. I mean, when Ray Moody wrote Life After Life, it was horrifically scandalous book
Yeah.
to particularly evangelical Christians, by the way. And the reason it was so awful was nobody goes to hell.
Yeah.
You know, everybody sees the light and is absorbed into some kind of unconditional love or light. And that's just a big problem. if you belong to a tradition that needs certain people to go to hell who don't think like you or believe like you.
Right.
So I think, to me, again, this is the power of these experiences. It actually doesn't matter what you believe.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Whether
Yeah.
this happens to you or not is irrelevant to what somebody believes or thinks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like a friend used to say, it's like a second grade class. You know, they were arguing over how far it was from the Earth to the moon, so they settled it by voting on it. You know, so. Let's. I think we've got time for one more question. I see Dolores, one of our guests, has her hand up, and Dolores, if you would click on join as panelist and turn on your video. There you go. So start your video and unmute, and let us hear your question. Welcome.
Okay, I just wanted to share.
Uh-huh.
I'm a Reiki master and do magnified healing. So I do this in partnership with spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have gone back in time to correct health issues that have left their mark on a person in the present in order for that person to be healed. I have also arranged for Rube Goldberg arrangements for energy to be available to people who are in need of it at moment's notice. And so I know that there is the back and forth between earlier and future. Also, I have small particle physics has been a backbone for me to be able to understand the movement of energy that I do. And one of the things that my companion spirit said, let's do a concrete experiment to show people that how this works. And I am living in a retirement community because my legs don't work very well and I need to have a scooter. So I don't plug that scooter in. It's electric. And when I sit on the scooter seat, if I've had a good night, I can watch the green go up. And if I am on my way and I stop to talk with someone who is in terrible need and I feel the energy going out, I watch that green go down. So I don't bother plugging in anymore. I just go and see what's going to happen now.
That's great. Thank you, Dolores. Thank you. Jeff.
Do you want me to comment on that? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know what to say to that other than those are impossible. That's impossible. But again, can we keep that on our table? Can we think with that? And how do we put Dolores's experiences in conversation with other people's energetic healing experiences? I think that's really the question.
Well, that's great. And well, I said last question. There was one more that came in on our Q&A that just said some psychics have experienced non-human galactic spiritual beings, you know, from galactic environments. And some say our galactic families or ancestors may be connected to that. Do you experience any of that in your work?
Well, again, this is what I mean by the imagination. I mean, I've worked with a channeler who talks about guides. I mean, other people talk about spirits. Other people talk about dead souls, or who are alive. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that human beings experience these things. And I'm not saying that the experiencer is lying or is fraudulent, but the experience itself is already interpreted, is what I'm trying to say. It's already being framed by the imagination. And so I think it's more complicated than we realize. And to me, that allows me to think with those people, but not to literalize or take take literally whatever they happen to be saying.
Well, that's a good way to look at it. And it's kind of, the basis, I think, of your book and what you've been talking about. So, well, I'll tell you, this is one of the greatest conversations we've had for a while, Jeff, and it's such a pleasure to have you with us. We'll ask Patricia to come back on board. And between, your great dialogue with Patricia, you've really unearthed some realities for us, I think, and ways of looking at what we put on the table, as you say, and how we look at our own assumptions. And so I think this has been great. So we sure appreciate it. I wanted to ask what comes next for you, or are you working on any more books or any more projects at the time?
Well, yeah, I'm always doing something. I mean, that's the nature of things, right? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, if you're a writer, you're always working on another book. And so I'm really interested in physics, to be honest. Physics and mystical experience is really the topic of the next book, and how they're related or how they're not related.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's a big question there. And so that's what I'm working on.
Well, it seems like there is a lot a lot of overlap between quantum mechanics and
Well,
mysticism.
that's what the book's on.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, we'll have to bring you back. That's another one. So
yeah.
I'll tell people that they can keep up with your work. You can buy his book, but also you can see more about his work and his books at his website, which is jeffreyjkripal.com. And also Patricia, you can learn more about her. She has a great podcast and does a lot of works and groups herself. And her website is simply patriciapearce.com, Pearce. And lastly, you can learn more about the center and all the stuff we have going on in upcoming programs and videos at our website, contemporarymysticism.org. And I'll remind you again to remember in about 3 weeks, our all-day contemplative retreat on Saturday, November the 9th. And that can be attended in person if you're in the Philadelphia area, or online. So that's it. And thank you, Jeff and Patricia, for this wonderful dialogue we've had today. So we'll wrap it up and say until we meet again, be safe, be well, and remember, you are perfect just exactly as you are. Namaste.
All right.
Bye-bye. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Love to all.